have Charlie Cook back, but even better, we now have Amy Walter with us as well. Charlie, you look good. You lost weight. I hope you will keep healthy that way. Amy, welcome. I know that you joined the Asia Society tour to this part of the world a couple of years back. We are delighted that you can be with us here online, but hopefully pretty soon both of you will be able to join us physically here in Hong Kong and in this part of the world. So with that, I just want to welcome you and turn over to Alice Mong, our Executive Director, who will take it away. Alice, it's yours.
Thank you, Ronnie. And I want to welcome our online audience as well as in-person audience. And I think these two speakers today really needs no introduction. I've been a big fan of Amy and also having known Charlie since 2008 when we had a chance to go to China. I believe, Charlie and I even share a podium at the AmCham. We talked about American politics. So it's really great to have Charlie back with us. And this last 2 years, I think Ronnie's correct. Charlie has done, in fact, right before before COVID, January of 2019, Charlie was here at Asia Society in person. And that was the last time Asia Society Hong Kong had an in-person luncheon program. And it was almost full house because of Charlie. So thank you, Charlie, for being back. And we want to welcome Amy Walters. Every time in fact, I still watch Amy on PBS NewsHour to keep abreast of what's happening in the United States in terms of the political climate. And so I think no introduction. Amy is now the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. And the Cook Report, of course, was founded by Charlie in 1984. So we're delighted to have both of them here. And really, in fact, I know the election result, the Georgia runoff will be happening as we speak. And hopefully, I don't know, by the end of this breakfast, we will hear the result. But either way, it really doesn't matter now. I think the numbers are the House and the Senate is already pretty much despite the Georgia win. I think we already know, who controls the House, who controls the Senate. And in fact, some of the questions I really want to lead to is about the future. But let's start off with the past. We're about, it's been a month since the midterm election. And the results, as I mentioned before, it's already pretty much clear. So I want to ask both of you to kind of maybe, Amy, to get us started, kind of your reflections on the midterm election. What surprised you or not surprised you? What happened to the red wave or the red ripple? So Amy?
Right. Sure. Thank you. And thank you for having me. And yes, I would love to be in Hong Kong in person at some point. I know that Charlie has great stories of being with you all. And now it seems as if we can make that trek across the world and hopefully be able to see all of you in person very soon. Charlie and I talk about this a lot, about the things in elections that are unique to each election, right? Every election has something about it that makes it different from any other election that we've seen before. But there are also through lines. There are things that are consistent from election to election. There are fundamentals that matter in every single election. And so the question is always, which is going to be the more important element? The sort of fundamentals, the things that we know to be critically important from election to election, things like opinions about the president, opinions about the state of the economy, where the most competitive races are happening. A third of the Senate is up every 2 years. The makeup of those races matters a lot. Or is it going to be something that's different, something that's unique to this moment in time, whether it's an issue, for example, the last time we saw a party in the White House actually pick up seats in the House was in 2002. That obviously was an election that took place after a momentous and tragic occasion after the attacks on 9/11. So that had much more of an impact than the traditional sort of fundamentals about, the president in a first term holding the White House, his party losing seats. So this year, I think what we learned was that some of the fundamentals mattered and some of the fundamentals didn't matter. And the ones that mattered, it is still very difficult when you are the party holding the House, the Senate, and the White House, especially by the narrowest of margins, to hold that trifecta, to hold on to all those branches for 2 years, or I'm sorry, beyond 2 years. So to be able to hold the House and the Senate going into a midterm election and continue to hold majorities in the House and the Senate after a midterm. That continues to be one of the most difficult things to do in politics. The last president who was able to do such a thing was Jimmy Carter in 1978. And his party did lose seats that year, but they had such big majorities that it didn't matter so much. So that mattered. Losing seats in the House. We've seen now in the last 20 midterm elections, 18 of them, including this one, the president's party loses seats in the House. This year it was 9 seats. That's a pretty small number compared to what we've seen over the last few midterm elections, but because Democrats had such a narrow majority, it was enough to flip the House. The thing that was different and that we were grappling with throughout the election was the fact that opinions about the president, while they are incredibly important and they are very predictive of how people will vote in an upcoming election, they weren't as determinative as they had been in previous elections. So, for example, if you go back and you look at the last 4 midterm elections, opinions of the president and how the president's party did in Senate races, in almost all of the most competitive Senate races up in those previous midterm election years, when the president's approval rating in that state was 45% or below, his party, the candidate, lost that race because voters would say, well, you know what? I don't like what the president's doing. And so I'm going to vote for change, right? The status quo, I'm not happy with the status quo. So what can I do about that? I can vote for the change candidate, which is the candidate of the other party. This election, if you look at the states and the Senate that Democrats won, they won them despite the fact that the president wasn't just simply below 45% approval rating. In some cases, he was at 41, 42, 43% approval rating. So very low approvals of the president. And yet those Democratic Senate candidates were able to prevail, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, because Democrats were really effective in turning the contest, the midterm contest, away from just being about Joe Biden, just being about people being upset about the direction of the economy or the direction that the country was going in. But they also were able to make it about the Republicans, make it about their Republican opponent, who they were able to make the case pretty effectively that those candidates were too extreme. They were the outliers. They were the ones that were pushing the boundaries, not the Democrats. And so what we saw in so many of these Senate races where Democrats were successful, they did 2 things. One, they outperformed Biden in part because they won independent voters, those critical swing voters, by double digits. That does not normally happen in a midterm election. At least since 2006, we've seen independent voters go overwhelmingly for the out party, the change party. In this case, they stuck with the status quo. And because so many voters saw the Republican alternative as the bigger risk. When you look at exit polls asking voters, who do you think was the more extreme candidate? They would name the Republican and the Democrat. The Republican candidate was seen as the more extreme candidate in every single one of these races. I think the fact that you had questions about voter, what we call election integrity, or candidates affirming that the 2020 election was actually done above board, that you had an issue like Roe versus Wade overturned, and the issue of abortion in some cases literally on the ballot, where voters in a number of states were voting about putting into law access to abortion. I think it helped to motivate Democratic voters and other voters, but independent voters as well, that the risk of the out party wasn't just theoretical, but it was actually pretty clear. You didn't have to tell voters that that abortion was on the ballot, or that their vote mattered for this issue. They knew that because they saw a 49-year-old precedent overturned. You didn't need to remind voters, although they did very much, that access to the ballot box, candidates who will admit to the integrity of the election, candidates who will agree that if they lose, they will concede. That was something that, again, it's not theoretical to voters after they watched January 6th. And President Trump was as much of the focus of this 2020 election as Joe Biden. And as we know, Trump remains as polarizing as ever, and in some cases, even more so than Biden. And finally, the issue of voters making this decision between, do I pick the economy? Do I pick abortion rights? Do I pick democracy? Do I pick how did the voters make their choice? I think what we saw was that voters who didn't think that Biden was doing a particularly good job, who didn't think that the economy was doing well, didn't trust Biden on handling the economy, nonetheless gave Democrats their votes. That's something we hadn't seen before, where voters who somewhat disapproved of Biden still voted for Democrats by 4 points. In the 2018 election, voters who somewhat approved of Donald Trump, somewhat disapproved of Donald Trump. Okay, so these are voters who, they don't hate the current incumbent, but they also think they're not really doing a particularly good job. Normally, they vote overwhelmingly for the other party. In this case, as I said, those who somewhat disapproved of Biden still ended up voting for Democrats by about 4 points. Just to show you what a big change that was from previous elections in 2018, Trump lost those voters by 30 points, or Republicans lost those voters by 30 points. So voters who said that the economy was poor, they didn't say it was terrible, but they didn't think it was doing well, voted for Democrats with 62% of the vote. So voters were able to do both things, say, I'm not happy with the direction that Democrats are going in, but I also think that the risk of putting Republicans in these places was much more significant.
Okay, Charlie, your view on the midterm.
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Alice and Ronnie. And I suspect that when I'm 105 years old with cereal droop coming down my chin, I will remember going around Hong Kong Harbor with the two of you on Ronnie's boat. But thanks for the opportunity to be with all of you. I don't literally know anyone who wasn't surprised by the outcome of this election, but the longer I think about it, the more it makes sense what happened, and that there weren't any factors that we had not taken into consideration, but it was the weighting, as Amy said, the weighting, how much weight do you put on this issue versus that issue, that I think made all the difference in the world. And the end of the day, as Amy said, voters were not happy at all with President Biden and with Democrats. And she ran through the numbers of people that somewhat disapproved of the president overall. Other numbers about people who somewhat disapproved of how he had handled the economy, which, always had been a deal breaker in the past. But I think what ended up happening is this, that while voters were angry at President Biden and Democrats, they were afraid of former President Trump and a certain kind of Republicans, the MAGA, Make America Great Again Republicans, that and that as strong an emotion as anger is, fear is an even stronger one. And what's very interesting to me is that, if you looked at the circumstances, you would just assume that Democrats would lose 20, 30, 40 or more seats in the House and probably lose some Senate seats, although the relationship's not quite the same. But even with what we overall knew happened in the election, if someone told you that Republicans would win the national vote for the House of Representatives by 3 million votes, by 3 percentage points, you would just assume that that Republicans picked up, that Democrats gained, 20 or more seats. And that's what was so interesting about it, was that Republicans got the votes overall they needed to win control of the House, but they didn't get them in the right places. And so for the first time, they can kind of identify with Al Gore and Hillary Clinton about having more votes, but just not having them where you actually needed them. But it is so interesting that when you look at individual races, at what, the most competitive House, Senate, gubernatorial, Secretary of State, Attorney General races, that the closer a Republican was identified with former President Trump, the more they were identified as part of the Make America Great Again movement, the worse they did in competitive races. Wasn't that much of a factor, but sort of normal, traditional, legacy, old-fashioned Republicans, they actually did fine in this election. It was just a certain kind that fell short. And that I think that, as I said, that fear is a stronger emotion, that you had things, for example, take the abortion issue. And, in retrospect, did I think that the economy and inflation would play a greater role than it did? Yes. And did abortion and the Dobbs decision matter more than I thought? Yes, I would agree with that. But I also think on the abortion issue, it was an issue that was near and dear, strongly affecting a lot of people. But I think it was also not just an issue, but it was a symbol. That if you could have 49 years of accepted public policy, broadly accepted public policy, and then throw it out in a moment, that's a little disorienting. And when you had people basically denying the outcome of a free and fair election, and we've had close elections for longer than I've been alive, going back to Truman in 48, to Truman Dewey, and Nixon Kennedy in 60, and Humphrey Nixon in 68. I can go on and on and on of really close races. And sometimes they went to court to get to the bottom of it, like Al Gore did in the Supreme Court. But at the end of the day, it was always an accepting of what the people had said. And to have that not happening, to see hundreds, thousands of people rampaging through the Capitol building, all these things were disorienting. And the thing is, the American people are open begrudgingly to change, but always incremental change and never radical change. And suddenly, while most Republicans are small c conservative, you had a new subspecies of Republicans that were not conservative, but pretty radical in a lot of ways, and overturning the ways we have done things. And I think that for a lot of suburban voters, college-educated white voters that used to be Republican, had edged over towards Democrats, they were upset with President Biden. They were inclined to go against Biden and Democrats again. But I think in the last few weeks, there was a push and pull for them. And when it came down to it, that last 5, 6, 8 percentage points of voters just said, you know what, I don't like what I'm seeing here. And I realize this is sort of a painful metaphor, but to me, when I look at what I've known the Republican Party all my life to be, it's like someone that's in an abusive domestic relationship, an abused spouse, and maybe they have an inkling that this is a bad relationship out of, but sometimes it's hard to get out. And that Republicans, many of the kinds of Republicans that Amy and I know and have long known and dealt with and all that, this is very painful for them because they know that this isn't where their party should be. It's not respectful of its traditions. It's not helpful for where they need to go in the future. But breaking away from this is just really, really hard. And so I think you're going to see a Democratic Party that may have won for the wrong reasons, a Republican Party that may not have completely learned from their lessons, and a relatively paralyzed U.S. political scene, and the U.S. Going for a while longer of not being able to play the sort of leadership role in the world that we did for 3/4 of a century after World War II. So this is a time of a lot of flux, a lot of uncertainty. It was a very surprising election, but I think in retrospect, I kind of kicked myself, wow, I didn't see this coming, but nobody else seemed to either. So I can't beat myself up too much. But this was a very, very interesting election, and it was sort of against all precedent, but it did make, in retrospect, it made a lot of sense.
Okay, before I turn away from the midterm, the past, one of the questions I've been dying to ask both of you, I think Charlie knows I'm a Buckeye, and now Amy, everybody else knows, and I'm also wearing scarlet and gray today in honor of my alma mater, and also in partly because of Herschel Walker too, because as a football player and football is such a big tradition.
I'm going to be rooting
as
for
well.
Michigan against Ohio
Well,
State.
we won't go there. We won't go there, Charlie. But one of the question I've just been curious. Trump was going around endorsing various candidates, and most of the candidates he endorsed did not win. But J.D. Vance is now our senator from the great state of Ohio. And in fact, first time we've heard of J.D. Vance was here in this when I believe David Petraeus talked about Vance when the book came out, Hillbilly Elegy. So we have heard of him, and now that he is in politics, that he is going to be in the Senate. So I'm curious about what happened in Ohio. And you mentioned the abortion case in Ohio. Abortion was a big issue because of when the case about the 10-year-old. So I'm just curious, is that an anomaly? Did Vance won on his own, or did he won because of the endorsement from Trump? And what does that foretell about Ohio coming?
I am not as nice a person as Amy, and so I'm going to jump in on this one first.
Okay.
You're either a member of the U.S. Senate or you're not. And J.D. Vance is going to be a member of the U.S. Senate. But I think I would put an asterisk to say just barely, and that he's so dramatically underperformed. When you look at the kind of numbers that Mike DeWine, who by any standard is a very effective governor, and when you look at the efforts that Senate Republicans and the Minority Leader Mitch McConnell did to drag J.D. Vance's rear end across the finish line, he won, but it was not a pretty sight, and he was a real serious underperformer. The standard for Donald Trump for endorsement seemed to be, how loyal are you? Are you going to be unquestionably loyal no matter what to me? Yes or no? And whether you were qualified to be a U.S. senator or not, whether you would be an effective candidate, whether you had ever done this before or not, didn't make a whole lot of difference. It was really about loyalty, about fealty. And I think that's and I think Republicans paid a price, because the normal run-of-the-mill Republican did fine in this election, did quite well, actually. But it was a group that were largely handpicked by or heavily influenced by Trump. that squandered a lot of important elections that Republicans, I think, otherwise would have won. And, yes, Vance got across the finish line, but, and we'll see what happens. I'm keeping an eye on the Georgia numbers because it's closed up a little bit just since we've been on the phone, on this call. But his candidates, the closer you were identified to Donald Trump, the worse you did. And J.D. Vance was very closely associated, and he just barely won in a state that a potted plant ought to win as a Republican.
Thank you. Amy, you have anything to add in that?
So Democrats were blessed in 2022 with a great map. That map is not going to be so great in 2024, but in 2022, for Democrats to hold the majority, they didn't need to win any state carried in the previous election. So Ohio didn't matter to their majority hopes. And quite frankly, neither did Pennsylvania, even though Biden won that state. But winning in places like Nevada, New Hampshire, Arizona, and now Georgia mattered a lot. New Hampshire a lot because obviously that's what kept them the majority. And but again, those are all states that Biden carried in the previous election. What we have right now, both at the federal and the state level, is a country that is more polarized than ever and is more calcified in its polarization. We have fewer split Senate delegations than any time since the direct election of senators. There are only 5 states that send a Democrat and a Republican to Washington. And there were only 2 of those states voted for Joe Biden. 3 of those states voted for Donald Trump. At the state legislative level, there are fewer split government, right, where there could be a governor and of one party, legislature of another, or the legislature is split, and a governor of that same party. Then anytime since the 1950s, the early 1950s. So I think what I took from this election is that the sorting that the last 20 years have provided of moving states and congressional districts into blue or red has become even more calcified, and that a really strong candidate like Tim Ryan, running an excellent campaign, still only did 3 points better than Joe Biden did. A candidate in North Carolina who ran a great campaign, Sherry Beasley, against a pretty not nothing, but a nobody, a Republican who was also endorsed by Donald Trump, who also had to get pulled across by outside money because he was a terrible fundraiser. Basically was a couple points under Biden's performance in North Carolina. A really strong candidate in Colorado, Republican. A really strong Republican candidate in Washington state for the Senate, 2 states that Biden carried, got blown out. So we now have a playing field. It's been narrow for a while. It just gets narrower and narrower and narrower. Candidates mattered this year, but they only mattered in certain states and in certain districts. It was critically important in a state like Arizona that Mark Kelly was running against somebody like Republican Blake Masters, who was so far on the extreme. But as Charlie called him, like a normal Republican could have won that race. A normal Republican in New Hampshire would have won that race. A normal Republican in Pennsylvania would have won that race. So I think if Republicans are going to take something from this election, it's that, the closer you guys hew to Donald Trump, the harder it's going to be to win those states that Donald Trump lost in the last election. At the same time, it doesn't penalize them in the states that are already Trump states.
I think now I'm going to turn to the present. And I think what you talked about, normal Republican, And I'm not sure how you would put Herschel Walker in that category. But let's talk about Georgia. As we are speaking, the runoff is happening. In fact, the results are coming in, and I'm sure both of you will have the latest information about the runoff between Warnock and Herschel Walker. So what is the latest, and what is your prediction in terms of who's going to take the Georgia Senate seat? And I think, Amy, you talked about money. I mean, my understanding is there were a lot of money that poured in this runoff because of the importance. In the end, it didn't matter the numbers or the Democrats are already have the majority, but symbolically, it was very important. So, kind of talk about Georgia right now.
Go ahead.
Amy.
Well, no, I was going to say when we came on.
Okay, whatever, Charlie.
When we came on, Reverend Senator Warnock was ahead by almost 11 percentage points. As of right now, it's 3 percentage points, and this is with 55% of the vote in. Virtually every poll, every indicator out there, I mean, we knew it was going to be close, but was suggesting that Warnock would come in ahead. But I did something on cable yesterday, and I made the point that the one thing that would worry me if I were a Democrat is I was listening to a focus group and heard a woman refer to Herschel Walker as a buffoon, and then in the very next sentence say that she was definitely voting for him. And the thing is, Amy used the term tribal, which is a good term, but you could also just say team. It's my team versus their team. And I may not like their quarterback, and I may not like their coach, and I may not like their wide receiver, but this is the team I'm for. And that's it. And you have people on a Democratic team and people on a Republican team, and quality of candidates, intelligence, likely to be effective matters a lot less than who is going to represent the values that I see my party as having, and who would I desperately not want to see someone from that party in the office. And that's what it's sort of come down to now.
Amy?
Yeah, agree with that. And Georgia's a 50-50 state. And Charlie's right. I think at the end of the day, this likely to be maybe a 2-point race where Warnock right now, because of the early vote lead he built up, and because of the strength he has in and around the Atlanta suburbs, which has been why Democrats have been able to be successful in Georgia, is because their success in the Atlanta suburbs. It's still not enough. I mean, you can look at, it's a glass half full, glass half empty kind of situation, right? You could say, well, Democrats won in a 50-50 state. Now for let's see here. I don't know how we're going to count this, Charlie. 2020, 2021, 2022, but having runoffs in both of those. So is it 4 times? Is it 2 times? Whatever. We can call it 4 times plus a presidential by the narrowest of margins. And the fact that the vote in this election isn't going to look, again, we'll have to wait to see, that much different from, say, Warnock and Kelly Loeffler, or the Purdue Ossoff, or Ossoff and Loeffler, the candidates who ran last time, despite the fact that Herschel Walker has a great deal more baggage than those other 2 Republicans had. Tells you everything about what Charlie was mentioning earlier, that this isn't about, right, Herschel Walker being a better or worse candidate. It's about, at the end of the day, and I think this is where we are right now. If you look at the last 2 presidential elections, look at these last 2 midterm elections, we're talking 30,000, 40,000 votes in these swing states determining who wins the Electoral College, who doesn't, who wins control of the Senate, who doesn't, who wins control of the House, who doesn't. And so the candidate quality did matter, in as much as I think if you look at how well Brian Kemp did, if you had a Brian Kemp-like Republican, I don't know if Herschel Walker would have gotten this far. But because a Warnock was the candidate, it's basically, you know what this is? It's been a replay of 2020. And the candidates in those swing districts had the same problem that Donald Trump did, which is you can win your Republican base vote, but you're going to lose independents. And if you lose independents in a swing state, you're going to lose the race.
Before we leave Georgia, one question I think I wanted to ask both of you, and that is really the minority voters. And I think last time my understanding in Georgia is there was a large Asian American population in certain states. It used to not matter because Asians or and I'm also talking about Hispanics as well. Minority votes they used to be in a block, but certain states this election and also maybe 2024 that when you're talking about 2 percentage points, right? Certain demographics can really swing the votes one way. So I'm curious your observation about this election, this midterm, in terms of the minority voters, because last time, Charlie, you were on the program with us online with Bakari Seller and Christine Chen, and we talked about the changing demographics of voters. So again, this is a question as an Asian American, Chinese American, and I vote, and I've only voted in swing states, Ohio and now Virginia. So it's important, and I have a lot of friends here who are Americans very concerned about what's happening in the United States. So can you talk about some of that, the changing dynamics of you don't want to call them minorities either, because right now in a few years we had David Henry Wong here this weekend, and I think the minority will become majorities in a few years in certain. I think it's already happening in California and Los Angeles. So can you kind of either of you briefly talk about the impact of these? I guess the minority, whether it's Hispanic or Asian, how it's impacted in this midterm. Amy, you want to go first?
Sure. So you are absolutely correct that especially in Metro Atlanta, the AAPI vote has become really significant, and it's Chinese, it's Southeast Asian. You've got a whole bunch of folks moving into Atlanta, and in fact, what you're seeing in many of these new, if we want to call them the new sort of swing areas or swing states, what they have in common is a major metro area. So Atlanta, Denver, Phoenix, in Northern Virginia, it's obviously DC, right? That attract a very diverse citizenry. And as more and more people are drawn to those areas, and I think Atlanta, it is not just people moving in. I think for years it was considered a place to go if you're Black American. Here is a central city where there is opportunity. And now it's an international city. It is a place where you're getting people from all over the world, not just coming to for a couple of years, but settling there, raising families there. And as the suburbs, if you've been to Atlanta, boy, it is miserable. The traffic is just horrific. The degree to which that city has grown and continues to move and move and move, drawn in part not just by Americans moving in, but international as well. I think what we saw in this midterm election, though, was a bit of a mixed bag. Democrats' success, especially at the House level, was driven in large part by the success that they had in districts that are more that are whiter, that are more educated, that are wealthier. There was part of the reason Charlie noted this earlier, that you could have a an election where Republicans will end up winning the national House vote, probably by about 3 points, but only pick up 9 seats, is that Democratic drop-off in majority non-white districts, whether they're Latino or Black or a mixture of all different, like Los Angeles is a perfect example of this. It's a little bit of everything, was pretty significant. Now, it didn't cost Democrats seats because those are districts that they win, let's say normally by 40 points, and instead the Democrat won it by 20 points because the turnout was lower there. Lower Latino turnout probably cost Democrats seats in California, and in Florida, but did not cost Democrat seats in Nevada or in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. So there's a little bit of a mixed bag. But if I'm Democrats, I guess I would be, as one Democratic strategist who works in the Latino community said to me, he said, look, the good news is Democrats aren't doing any worse with Latino voters since 2020. The bad news is we're not doing any better with Latino voters since 2020. So sort of holding their own. In majority Asian House seats, like in Orange County, Republicans still held on to those districts. So there is still, I think we're seeing some shifting sort of on the edges, but there is absolutely no doubt that these voters who are not white voters are having a very important impact.
Amy and I have both done this for a long time, and I had noted this year, and I'm not sure it was true in the past, this is the first time in the national exit polls that I've noticed that Asian Americans were a specific breakout at 2% of the vote, and that for the House, it voted 58-40 in one of the two exit polls. But I think we have to be careful, because saying Asian American or AAPI is kind of like saying Latino or Hispanic, where it kind of matters. Somebody that's of Cuban heritage is pretty different from someone who is Puerto Rican or Mexican American or whatever. That within subgroups of where they or their ancestors came from can make enormous differences, and so generalities are not good. But the fact is, it is now the share is now getting to the point where it is seen, it is acknowledged, it is appreciated, and particularly with African Democrats losing share with African Americans and Latinos, that a group that's growing as quickly as Asian Americans are will just become, that much more important than they were 4, 6, or 8 years ago.
I think that what you said is so true, Charlie. It's not. I think none of these communities are monolith in terms of them voting one way. In fact, I noticed a trend. There was, I think, an election in I think it's California, where a Korean American candidate accused the American-born Chinese, I think from maybe Taiwan or China, or parentage from China, of playing the China card, and that the Asian, in some ways, kind of like what Herschel Walker and Warnock is doing, right? The blacks against black, and but that election, my understanding is the Korean American Congresswoman incumbent won, and I don't know if she ended up apologizing for the comment she made about the American-born Chinese veteran. So I think what you said is so true about there is not, one vote, I guess, among AAPIs. But I guess now I want to go turn to the future. And here we're in Asia, and you're here in Hong Kong specifically. And I think midterms has always been about local politics, right? It's always about economy. And in fact, it sounds like what you guys said really echo one of the speaker in this room a few days ago, maybe economy, something, Trump's social issues, and people are more worried about inflation's economy this around this election than maybe the abortion issue, maybe. But going forward for the future, for the 2024 presidential election, I want to ask you both about, what are some of the, okay, first of all, candidates from both parties. Who are you guys looking at? That's one. And also, what are some of the who are some of the states that might make a difference? I mean, I kind of get the sense Ohio is no longer the swing state, but maybe Georgia and Virginia or other states. But what are the states that we should pay attention to for the 2024? And the third question, really, again, is domestic versus international. Do you think China, Ukraine, I mean, the global issues, how is that going to play out in the 2024 election, if at all, or because of the way, I mean, this kind of reminds me of what was it George Bush about? It's all about economics, stupid, right? So is it going to be about economics, or will a geopolitical, well, I'm personally concerned about the China card, but would that play different in the 2024 elections? China seems to be one of the issues that both the Democrats and the Republicans kind of agree on in terms of bashing. So the first part, candidates, both sides, who do you think will be representing either the Democrats or Republicans? And the second part, states that matter. And the third is local, economics versus geopolitical. So
I'm going to flip it around and do the last one first, just because it's easier. Unless there are U.S. military casualties involved, there's not been an election affected by foreign policy in a half century in this country. That Americans just don't vote. I mean, and it says something sad about Americans and how isolated we are, but Americans do not vote on foreign policy, period. It just doesn't happen. And so it's pretty easy. And the fact is, the Russian invasion of Ukraine had zippo relevance to the outcome of this election. Not a bit. And so that just sort of doesn't happen. But I think the old Tip O'Neill adage of all politics is local could not be more untrue. It has not been true in decades. It certainly isn't now. That at least in terms of general elections, it's completely nationalized, and increasingly we get these manufactured issues that people don't even deal with in their daily lives. When you see a small town or rural school system fighting over transgender athletes, and you wonder if there are any transgender athletes, in that or any adjacent county, but where it's fueling an outrage machine, and that's out there, so that it's national, not local. But a lot of them just aren't even, or are only real issues to a very, very, very tiny share of the electorate, but that are used for the purposes of inflaming somebody, one group or another.
And then I'll just quickly do the states that matter. Again, unless there's some other dramatic event that we don't know about, that's suddenly going to make a different state catapult into this category. I think we have our two new purple states, our two new swing states, Georgia and Arizona. Virginia and Colorado, we thought were going to be swing states for a little while. They first got put on the map by Barack Obama. Actually, Nevada was in that category too. Nevada, Colorado, Virginia first got put into that category in 2008. Virginia and Colorado are now basically blue states, with Nevada still in, I would still put it in that purple category. It's maybe blue tinged because Democrats still able to hold on to the Senate seat there. Biden wins narrowly there. Hillary Clinton wins narrowly there, but that swing state. So the Western states, Arizona and Nevada, definitely now classic swing states. Georgia, now our new Sun Belt swing state. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, those Midwestern states, with, I would say, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, the most swingy of those states. New Hampshire is the only state left in the sort of New Englandy Northeast region. North Carolina is to Democrats what Nevada is to Republicans, where it's really close, but not quite there yet, is in terms of being a pure purple state. So that's more of a pink state. And I think that's where the battle lines are drawn. Now, there's going to be debate among Democrats about whether they should go into Ohio and Florida, states that have been on the swing map for years and years and years, or whether they should just abandon them and put all their efforts into those states that I mentioned. Republicans get lured sometimes into states like New Mexico, Oregon, but I don't know that they're going to be lured this time around. Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, much more fertile ground for them, and Wisconsin, of course, than those others.
So candidates, either one of you or both of you, who, on the Republican side, we were hearing about, DeSantis and others. There seems to be a kind of a deeper bench. Kamala Harris being on the Republican side, on the Democratic side. So ideas of candidates on for the presidential election?
Well, either Amy or I could come up with lists of people, but I think someone would be a total fool to say they thought somebody was going to be the nominee. And that, through my career, there have been people who 2 years out looked like they were a front runner for their party's nomination, and in a lot of cases never even made it to the convention. That just happens, and that there's an invisible primary that goes on, and people do well or people do badly and stumble, and so I would not begin to say who I thought would be the nominee on either side, but I'll be foolhardy on one side. I'd say my hunch is that neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden will be their party's nominees. That's as far as I'd go, and that's not inside information or anything. It's just kind of a hunch that and there are lots of different avenues that get from here to there. But my hunch is you'll have somebody different on either side, but I would not begin to hazard who it might be. And obviously Harris as a sitting vice president, we've had 4 consecutive sitting vice presidents in a row seek their nominations, and all 4 of them got it. Now 3 out of 4 lost the general election, but I don't. If President Biden were to announce he was not going to run again, I doubt if it'd be 12 hours before we knew more people that would be jumping in, because I don't think Vice President Harris would intimidate anyone from getting into that race.
Yeah, it is. I'll just echo Charlie in saying we're just really not good at this. Maybe that's a wrong way of saying it. It's that it is impossible to know how voters are going to react to certain candidates until they see those candidates. We don't know what the environment's going to look like. Today, we know what people are talking about. We don't know what people are going to be talking about a year from now. The candidate has to fit the mood as much as anything else. And look, the Biden campaign is up and ready to go, and they are putting all the pieces into place to run. And I think he got a boost from an election outcome in the midterms that wasn't as bad as it could have been, should have been, whatever, fill in the blank. The surprise of the 2022 midterms. There is not somebody sitting right now waiting to knock off Joe Biden, who's pouncing. And yet, we've never had an 82-year-old run for president. So this is totally uncharted territory. Ron DeSantis looks really good to a lot of people, but Ron DeSantis hasn't been on a stage with Donald Trump yet. Ron DeSantis hasn't been under the national microscope in the way that you do when you're running for president. Yes, he's been getting a tremendous amount of national attention, but it's very different when you're president. I'll just say, in my experience of trying to pick the front runner early, I've batted approximately 0. I was at ABC News in 2012, and one of my jobs was to pick young reporters to embed in the campaigns. These are young reporters who are with that presidential candidate like 24 hours a day. And so for my strongest reporter, I wanted to put her on a candidate that I was going to go the distance. And so I said, this is in 2012. And I said, hey, listen, I got it. You're going to go on the Rick Perry campaign. It's going to be great. And she was on that campaign for about 3 weeks. And then he dropped out. So I'm with Charlie. I'm going to wait.
All right. Okay.
Paul, Raphael Warnock was almost 10 points. It was about 10 points ahead and behind by about 1.5 points with 68% of the vote in. So I think it's going to be not just a long night. We'll go into the morning, but this is not, any of the polls that you saw the last 2 or 3 weeks would not have necessarily predicted this. Although, we knew this was going to be close no matter what.
Okay. We only have a few minutes, about 5-6 minutes left, and I need to ask the questions from the audience, Slido here. And one of the questions is, of course, it's about Trump. Trump's company just got convicted of tax fraud, and really has, we all know he's made some wild statements lately. What do you think this means for his prospect in 2024?
I'd say it's a drop in a bathtub. I mean, the thing is, he's had so many stories that heretofore would have been considered devastating that have, hardly moved the needle one way or the other. And the Trump organization getting indicted, in the big scheme of things, I don't think it's terribly important at all. But because it's kind of inside baseball. If he wants to get, if he were to get personally indicted, okay, then we can talk about that. But short of that, I don't think this is of any real consequence. People that hate him will be outraged, and people that love him will think this is just harassment.
Do you think he'll be personally indicted, Charlie?
I'm not a lawyer. I don't know.
Okay. Amy, you want to add to that any?
No, I think that's right. I mean, there's not much more. No one's ambivalent about Donald Trump. Right? You have a pretty strong opinion about him one way or the other, and people aren't really changing their minds about him. And so this idea that, there's going to be that one thing. There's going to be that one thing that's going to happen that's going to take all those Trump voters and turn them against him. Now, look, it's doing something in that it's turning those voters into DeSantis curious voters or another candidate curious voters. But if you look at the polling, those Republicans still like Donald Trump. It's not that they suddenly said, oh, whoops, I made a mistake. He was terrible. I shouldn't have voted for him in the first place. I'm going to go pick another guy. They're like, well, I don't know that he can win. There's all this other stuff swirling around. So he was great. He did a great job. But now let's pick somebody who's going to be able to win this next election, doesn't have all the baggage and all the drama. Let's go with DeSantis.
The last question from the audience, from the Slido, was if Warnock wins, what will the Democrats be able to do in the House in the next 2 years that they have not been able to do this past 2 years? Or is it going to be a gridlock?
They're not able to. If Warnock wins, and it's gridlock if Warnock loses.
Yeah. I guess the other thing, though, is it depends on your definition of gridlock. So is legislation of any significance going to make it through Congress? No. But part of the reason that Biden, like his predecessors, Obama and Trump, when they had trifecta, pushed through big pieces of legislation when they have the opportunity, whether it was Obamacare or it was the tax cuts, or in this case, it's the Inflation Reduction. And I guess that was the most significant one-party vote versus the bipartisan bills on chip manufacturing and infrastructure. But part of the reason you do that is that you know you're going to spend the next 2 years not getting much legislating done, but you can still point back to and hope that the legislating that you have done pays dividends. And in this case, a lot of what's going to come online in 2023 and 2024 is legislation that got passed in 2022. So more chips manufacturing, right? There's going to be investments coming into communities. You're going to see the president out and about talking about that incessantly. Obviously, infrastructure dollars are still coming into the states. They're going to be building stuff and able to point to, Democrats will point to, well, this is because of us. And then the prescription drug benefit coming online in 2023 for seniors who are on Medicare. Democrats could talk about it in 2022, but it wasn't online yet. So they can talk about it for 2024. So the incentive for Democrats to get a ton done, it's not right. They got a lot that they have gotten done that they can continue to roll out as we get closer to 24.
Well, thank you both, because I think, Amy, what you said about the infrastructure is so true. I was just in Columbus in September, and I have never seen more cranes around the Ohio State University in recent years. And I think the last time I saw that many cranes was when Pudong was coming up, when I went there with Governor Voinovich in the 90s. So, and then also today, I think, was it Biden was going to be visiting a chip plant in Arizona. So I think some of the infrastructural projects that are, and also the CHIP Act, how much is going to play in the United States is going to be something for us here to watch. And I'm just so delighted that both of you can be with us. And I hope to invite you both back next year in person. It would be so great. I know some people think people are not interested in U.S. politics or U.S. as much, but I think in this part of the world, I think here in Hong Kong, and especially among Asia Society Hong Kong community, we are very interested, and we really hope to invite both of you here in person. And before the elections really kicks in, I know how busy you both will be traveling domestically covering the presidential election. So we'll find a window before that, and to have you both back with us, because you guys have gave us some really wonderful food for thoughts. And I can go on for another hour. I'm such a political junkie, somebody who grew up in a great state of Ohio, and my first political candidate was Barbara Bush. And so I remember her campaigning for her husband. So I can talk about politics forever, but U.S. politics forever. But anyway, thank you both. And what a great way to kick off this morning for us here in Hong Kong. And I know it's evening for you, but I know you guys will be staying up to watch the Georgia results. And I'll be watching you online, telling us what happened in Georgia. So thank you and goodbye. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Thank you.
Morning and good. Thank you for having us.
Take good care.
You too.